Hello and welcome to another episode of Into the Afroverse with your host, William Jones. And Into the Afroverse is where we're taking Black folks into the future. Today, we are yet again joined by Dr. Reynaldo Anderson. And if you were listening last week, you know that Dr. Anderson is an associate professor of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. He is currently the executive director and co-founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement, also known as BSAM, which is an international network of artists, intellectual, creatives, and activists. And he's also the author of several articles on Africana Studies and Communication Studies, and served as a member of the Curatorial Council, Carnegie Hall's Afrofuturism Festival. And with that, we're welcoming back Dr. Anderson. Once again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
All right, so, we ended the last session, we were talking about Afrofuturism moving forward, and you were sharing with us the way in which your work is, now being heard. Well, it's only been, it's been heard across borders around the world and so forth, but you just give us an example. I wanted to talk more about, well, first of all, you mentioned BSAM. I mentioned that in the introduction. Can you tell us a little bit more about that as well? Because when people hear Black speculative arts, they may have the same questions that they have about Afrofuturism.
Okay. BSAM came and emerged out of a series of meetings. And you could kind of say the inspirational moment about a decade ago, John Jennings and I, the artist, we traveled to Paris for a UNESCO event to present ideas. I had emailed John and said, all this crazy stuff's going on in the country. We need to go someplace and present our ideas and see how they resonate. And at this event in Paris, John presented his concept on what would become Black Kirby. And I did a presentation on critical Afrofuturism that was later published in an award-winning book that John and Francis Gateward published, where I talk about critical Afrofuturism in sequential art. And after that trip, when we got back from that trip, John asked me, did I know a young woman who would later become famous for her book named Yatasha Womack?
Right.
And I said, and I remember calling her and we had long conversations. I sent her a document that I was working on that I had presented in Paris that she later cited in her book. And then after that, John, along with Adila Funama, organized a couple of meetings at Loyola Marymount that were called the Astro Blackness meetings. And at those meetings, we met people like Tananarive Due, Stephen Barnes, Nedia Corafor, Nalo Hopkins, and you had all of this star power in one room. And it was no more than maybe, 60 people.
Right.
At the first two Astro Blackness meetings. That's why I said, I don't know if you could even get us all together like that anymore, unless some people put some dollars on the table. And so Walida Imarasa, the Octavia's Brood was there, and it was dynamic. Those two meetings, and then the meeting where I first met Alondra Nelson in Atlanta at Emory University about the Alien Bodies Conference organized by Moya Bailey and other people, where I first introduced the term in conversation with Alondra. We had a moment where I talked about, I said, no, this is the Afrofuturism 2.0 moment. And I articulated why it was different from the earlier articulations. And then a key meeting after that, two other meetings would be Planet Deep South, where we're talking about the impact of the Black South on Afrofuture culture. And then probably the meeting that brings a lot of these threads together in the wake of or during the Ferguson moment was the Ferguson is the Future meeting at Princeton that was hosted by Ruha Benjamin, where it brought together some of the protesters and a lot of the theorists and writers active now that you recognize. Because going into that meeting, we had started planning or prepping for that. We had already developed what would later be called Unveiling Visions, which was the first group of artists and curators to organize a Afrofuturistic exhibition in North America at the Schomburg Library for Black Studies and Research in Harlem.
Mm-hmm.
And it was during that time leading up to that and the Princeton meeting that we also had a meeting with the Afrofutures UK people in Manchester, England, where one of the conveners was a group of young artists in England that had an Afrofuture meeting. And it was at that meeting I met the organizers for Black Quantum Futures, Rashida Phillips and Moormother, and some of the other intellectuals on the other side of the Atlantic talking about this. And these all happened within weeks of each other, the Afrofutures UK meeting and the Princeton meeting, and then Unveiling Visions broke loose with we had about 70 artists and writers and thinkers there. That the exhibition was up in Harlem from late November to January, bringing these artists together. And it was after that meeting, that's kind of the Unveiling Visions conference really launches the movement, where the decision was then made to network it around the world. Because I had mentioned that I was going to do it. I announced it at the Princeton meeting that I was going to build this movement. And after the Unveiling Visions exhibition closed, my first few meetings, I got together with Maya Crown Williams to organize some of the first few events. It started there in St. Louis at a historically Black space at a HBCU.
Mm-hmm.
The second meeting was at Temple University at the invitation where it was supported by Malefi Asante and some of the other doctoral students. And then our first international meeting was hosted in Toronto by Quentin Versetti. And we were just on our way after that. And since then, we've had combinations of symposiums and presentations all over North America, all over Europe, from England, Germany, Italy, Spain, several countries in Africa, and the Caribbean and Latin America. And we're preparing to go to Medellin, Colombia this week to do some work with the Afro-Colombian community.
Excellent, excellent. So if you're just joining us, this is Into the Afroverse with your host, William Jones. And Into the Afroverse, we're taking Black folks into the future. And today we're joined by Dr. Anderson. With all that is happening right now, there's a presidential election on the horizon. We're seeing all these challenges when it comes to what can and can't be taught in the classroom, what books can and can't go into a library. We're seeing all of these things happening. What are your concerns? And of course, the ongoing issues of police brutality and so forth. What are your concerns moving forward for Black people that you see? And in what ways can Afrofuturism be used as an instrument or a tool to kind of address some of these?
Think about this. I would be able to say this. Looking to our past, two key figures that we also hold up. Would you agree that Martin Delany and W.B. Du Bois are figures that we cite in our Black speculative literature, right?
Certainly.
Well, what we can learn from our past, Martin Delany, who was also a military man of action, aligned people of African descent to fight for the North during the Civil War, and they were correct. So that meant that even though he was a staunch Black nationalist, and he's considered the father of Black nationalism, as well as a forerunner of Afrofuturism, they made the political decision to align with Northern liberal capitalists temporarily to go and crush the South.
Right.
And they did that.
Right.
And, and then we got some nominal freedoms to do some things after that. The second person that I want to mention, W.B. Du Bois, who writes The Comet, who was also a Pan-Africanist, basically realized there needed to be some kind of temporary alliance with liberals to defeat the fascists, which they did. They defeated the imperial forces of Germany in World War I and the Nazi Socialist Fascist Party in World War II. And after each time, the key thing to remember that to defeat what's in front of us, we might have to make some temporary alliances. That don't mean we got to be friends,
Right.
but I think the people need to come together next year and realize when the stupid argument said, oh, that neither the Democrats or the Republicans for us. I don't really care what they're talking about. I'm looking about what's in our interest. Now we know we're not going to get anything, and it could be worse from the MAGA fascists. And we know that certain people that got D's behind our names aren't our friends.
Right.
We got to articulate how do they serve their interests, because they look at us, how do we serve their interests? So what do we get out of the temporary alliance to defeat the MAGA people here domestically?
Right.
What do we get out of it? And that's how we need to be talking. I mean, so how that means we got to really critically look at, with the money in the budget, who gets what, who will be held to account and be punished if of what we want isn't delivered. And we got to be willing to punish people that look like us when stuff isn't delivered. Just because they look like us does not mean they're for us.
Right.
We can't be like, oh, the brother or the sister. No, not all those people are our brothers and sisters.
Right.
Okay. And we got to be tough enough to admit that. Mm-hmm. We can't look at, I remember something Maxine Waters said that was very profound a few years ago when people were like angry at Obama, and Obama had his limitations. She said, we can't be hard on him because you all love him too much.
Right.
Okay. Man, hey, they're just politicians. And we get, and so our politics need to be like, look, if you can't meet some of these demands that we care about, and you're more loyal to some donors who don't live in our community than you are to us, you have to go.
Right.
Period. Now, there'll be points that will give you the latitude to negotiate or compromise, sure. But, there are some deliverables that we want. And some of the people in our community may not like some of those deliverables because they're not really speaking for Black people. They're speaking for different constituencies that aren't even living in the community. And these data points are supported, and it's going to be more difficult, Will, because as the recent census, you go look at it, the Blacks that live in an urban space have a different set of values than the people in the suburbs, the Blacks in the suburbs.
Right.
But the Blacks in the suburbs, who tend to be more middle class, base what they want, claiming they speak for those of us that live in the urban spaces. That goes back to that internal fragmentation I was telling you about.
Right.
And I think that's why a lot of the protest movement of the last several years collapsed, because they had no real in-depth vision of how to navigate into the future. Is why it collapsed. The protest was not a visionary, futuristic framework where you're going to have to make some hard choices. It was more of a reform movement that was based on an older paradigm, which was not going to work in the new global realities. That was a paradigm that worked during the Cold War, but it is not a paradigm that works with the collapse of globalization.
I see. Now, in terms of preparing for this future, like you said, we can't use the old paradigms, and I agree with you 100% on that. And also, I like the distinction, because I think a lot of people don't recognize there's a distinction between an ally and a friend. Appreciate that as well. And you've given us some scholars to check out. What would be some other things you'd recommend? Because this is all about preparation. This is all about getting information out there. What else would you recommend in terms of reading or researching?
Here's what I read. If you want to just a piece, or you're one of the people that's, if you want to study Black music, the book I point to is Eric Steinskog's book, Afrofuturism and Black Sound Studies. Because he uses some European philosophy to engage African-American culture. And my thing is, if you don't like it because somebody from Denmark wrote the book, I tell them, hey, we'll write a better book then.
Right.
Well, I think it gives us a start to begin. Now, I wouldn't have critiqued it necessarily the same way he did, but our work is in conversation with other people's work around the world. Do you know that there are Chinese and Asians that are looking at Afrofuturism now in relation to their own philosophies? So this stuff is not going to happen in a vacuum. And so people are taking our work seriously. So if you're talking about Black music, two works, Eric Steinskog's Afrofuturism and Black Sound Studies, and a book I'm reading now, Jana Brown's book, looking at Black sound and music in the future. Those are two books that I probably start with because they'll lead you to everything else. If you're talking about, I would say, to understand the movement that we've built up to this point, some of the intellectual threads, you've got to get Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Astro-Blackness, and the Black Speculative Arts Movement, art plus design, because we deal with stuff like architecture, we deal with stuff like technology, we deal with strategic forecasting, and even hip hop. In those two volumes that should be read as one. Lonnie Brooks's book, When is Wakanda, is a good one. I think you can get that for like $9. That's a good book. The Topia book that was co-edited by myself and Tobias Van Veen is excellent in terms of some of the scholars that are in there. And then if you want to look at the first Black European product put out, Dr. Natasha A. Kelly's book, The Comet, that she put out a couple years ago, where you see Black European contribution. And the books I recommend are one that are basically based on the scholar is closely wedded to how Afrofuturism has been defined the last several years. Through those several books, you get basically pretty much 90% of where the argument is right at the moment. And the forthcoming volume that's going to be out here for African American studies aficionados is dealing with is called Africology, the rise of the Afrofuturist studies, and it's the shape of things to come. And those books really kind of give you a international panorama of where the movement is intellectually at this current moment, in terms of what to read.
That's an excellent list, thorough list. Thank you for that. So once again, you're joining us and Into the Afroverse with your host, William Jones. And Into the Afroverse is where we're taking Black folks into the future. And once again, we are joined by Dr. Anderson. We're talking all things Afrofuturistic. 2 letters for you. AI. Mm-hmm. What do you think when you hear that? And what can we learn from it? Should we be concerned? Or what should
AI, the first thing that came to mind was Natrice Gaskins.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, she's a digital scientist who's into AI. She was somebody, I told her she was going to be a star. She was ABD when she published in our Afrofuturism 2.0, was the first person to talk about Web 3.0 several years ago. And then she has an excellent book I recommend reading also on techno vernacular creativity. She is the leading voice for how we reconcile our culture with artificial intelligence. You know, how the knowledge of the ancestors can work with AI to create something for ourselves. AI is going to be a disruptive force in a whole host of areas around economics, politics. I think AI right now is being pioneered on the battlefield of Ukraine. That's why the smaller Ukrainian force, because of technology, is just killing the Russians. You know, they're probably killing them. Probably for every Ukrainian that dies, there are probably 5 Russians that die. And that's all the technological advantage that they have over the Russians. AI, the Ukrainians are using AI. That's why this war in Europe now is going to be a historic one in terms of the confluence of geopolitics and technology and 21st century warfare. The use of drones on a mass level. Like, for instance, you could have a battalion of drone operators, like 500 men. You give them 10,000 drones and they can take out an entire division of mechanized infantry division with just thousands of drones. And they're sitting off somewhere in a mountain shelter somewhere operating just wave upon waves of drone strikes. So that is the scope and scale of modern 21st century warfare in terms of how you clear out a space, identify an enemy, kill them, and then move into the space. The
Right.
Ukrainian war is going to be a signature thing for that. I think AI now, as you notice, even as an academic, we are dealing with in the classrooms this the last 90 days. This semester, I'll probably be remembered as the first Africana studies scholar that introduced it in the classroom, ChatGPT, with my graduate students. And they found out some interesting responses when I said, gave them a prompt for ChatGPT. One of the students asked, okay, how do you defeat white supremacy? And ChatGPT gave them an answer which shocked them. It was not a nuanced answer, but it gave them a preliminary outline of what to do. So the same way the desktop computer revolutionized how we move knowledge and deal with art and file sharing and everything like that, you really can't be an effective leader now, whether you're a protest leader or organizer or whatever, without AI assistance, because it's just going to amount you to scale up what you already know and make you more productive if you know what to do with it, And so that's why Tom Friedman and the New York Times and other people, they're terrified now, because AI, if you are a influential organizer, thought leader, and all that, it just allows you to take that up to the third level of the third power in terms of what you can create productively to advance certain perspectives. Say, for instance, the new Black protest movement decides to do it assisted by AI, where the AI helps you with your strategic thinking and outcomes, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's why, what would have Malcolm X done with an AI prompt?
Can you imagine?
Or Huey Newton,
Right.
or Sadi Shakur,
Right.
those type of things. So that's why to be a leader, to be a domestic policy maker these days I feel sorry for anyone who wants that job, because what you got to do with domestic policy now just to keep the peace is just became harder to do that, because now people can fact check you with artificial intelligence.
Right.
And kind of like 10 years ago when people started fact checking their pastor in the pews by Googling whatever their sermon was about.
Yes.
The chat GPT now can put together a better sermon than the average pastor.
Wow.
Oh yeah, that's why the African Methodist Episcopal Church recently sent out a missive encouraging their pastors to use artificial intelligence organizing their sermons.
Interesting.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, AI is yet again, like you said, it's kind of moving people forward at a rapid pace. Seems like every day there's a new headline, but also a new application.
This thing is shifting every 90 days.
Right. And what can we do to make sure that we're not left behind? You mentioned it, you're using it in the classroom. You mentioned churches introducing it. Collectively, what can we do to make sure we're not left behind?
I encourage people to use it. There'll be some sloppiness, hits and misses. But I'm like this, William, and I understand we're coming to a close. We got too many people or talking heads in our community that think they're leaders that are not prepared. And I'll give you the highway analogy. There are too many people that are driving 45 in the passing lane.
Gotcha.
And it's creating a traffic jam going back 50 miles. And it's because they know they don't have it to go forward, but they're moving from the passing lane in. They're driving 45 and moving in the passing lane to keep the William Joneses and others from going past them.
That's it.
And so that's an issue. There's a traffic jam at the moment, but I believe that will go away too, as those people that are driving 45 in the passing lane run out of gas and have to pull over to the side of the road, and the people that got a different engine that can go 70 or 80 are going to just leave them on the side of the road and get on down the highway. And that's how you got to think of this current moment. The bottleneck is going to, I think, be broken up over the next 18 months because a lot of people that have not reinvented themselves or prepared or are going to do the things to prepare them to go forward, they're just going to fall by the wayside. And they're going to be bitter about it and be mad and TikToking about it, because there's too much free stuff out here that you can take online to kind of adapt. I would tell anyone, take one of these free online data analytics courses. There's so much free stuff about here, how you can, augment yourself, and augmentation is part of that thing. You need to augment yourself at a low level with some type of AI, at least as an app on your phone to help you keep up until you figure some things out.
Right.
And just play with it like we did when the cell phones first came out, when Facebook and social media first came out. And then there's some old-fashioned stuff that I say draw upon in that Sankofa mind. Some of your grandmama and them could do stuff without technology, and they always had food in the house.
Right.
And they kept their house clean, and they didn't overly rely on somebody come. It's been a recent thing where we depended on people who didn't look like us to educate our kids. They were more self-reliant, and so that's why it's going to be a balance between looking at AI as a tool and not a lifestyle. And then how do you maintain and develop your internal resiliency to adapt to what Thomas Friedman in his book calls the age of acceleration, which is the last book I'll recommend.
Excellent. And, I would also add, we also have to be careful because, as you mentioned in that great analogy, as these folks get frustrated, that frustration will also turn to desperation. And we have to be mindful of that because they're going to do whatever it takes to hold on to their positions, their power. We got to be mindful of, the distractions that they'll put out there to keep themselves in the front. So I really like that and appreciate that. Once again, brother, it goes fast, man. It goes fast. In a couple of minutes. Well, first, will there be any appearances you'll be making in the very near future if folks want to see you in person or hear from you?
Oh man, I'm supposed to go to Medellin here this week, and I think that's my last one for the summer because I got to get some writing done this summer. So I'm going to take a break from traveling. I'm not going to teach this summer. I'm just going to work on my next group body of scholarship, and they'll definitely see me. I got another project I'm supposed to do with a major institution. Hopefully, I'll be able to announce pretty soon. I will be one of the first people to see it. And so I think a lot of stuff's going to happen here over the next 18 months that's going to reflect what our culture and politics looks like during this era of acceleration and what our opposition called the culture wars.
Well, that is excellent. I wish you all success with that, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. And anytime you want to come back and tell us about it, you let me know and we'll have you back on.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, that'll about do it for Into the Afroverse with your host, William Jones. And Into the Afroverse is where we're taking Black folks into the future. I'd like to thank all of you for continuing to support the work that we do here. And once again, you can find Into the Afroverse and the Afrofuturism Network on various social media. And you can listen to past episodes on YouTube on the Afrofuturism Network page. So one more time, thank you, Dr. Anderson. Appreciate it. And you guys have a good day. And a special shout out to Mr. Duke Productions for producing today's episode. Take care.